When Mary was 21, she had spent a full year in the emergency housing camp of Noisy-le-Grand. Then, needing an appendectomy, she returned to England for several months because the conditions in the camp, particularly in the dead of winter, were too harsh for her convalescence. Father Joseph Wresinski gave her several tasks to do before returning. He asked her to travel to Birmingham to help and learn from a woman running projects in a low-income community. Mary was also to recruit as many young people as possible to help to organise activities for children during the next summer holiday.
7th of March 1963. Dear Father Joseph, for 3 weeks now I've been meaning to write to you, but there's so much to do in kindergarten. Once, the main teacher was out, so I was alone with the children. I can barely keep order, and they know it. So they were perfect little devils. On top of that, I think I've caught bedbugs in the dreadful housing here. But don't worry, I'm being spoilt too. My godfather happens to live nearby. Before my father was killed in the war, they were close friends. On Saturday night, my godfather's son took me to a disguise party. He dressed as a toreador, and I was a flamenco dancer. Everyone watched us as we did the Paso Doble dance. I loved it. I keep thinking it's really crazy of us to work in the depths of poverty when a person could be happy doing something else. Is that a mean thing to say? To be frank, although I love the poor families I've gotten to know in Noisy-le-Grand and here, sometimes I think I should just travel around the globe. And of course, I'm just as poor as all the ATD volunteers. So maybe I'll have to marry an explorer, just for 2 or 3 years, to see the world. It would be impossible to bring a husband to the camp in Noisy. But anyway, I'm quite happy tonight, and tomorrow is always a new adventure. In addition to the kindergarten, I've been drumming up support for next summer holidays activities. And I think quite a few young people will join us. I'm also visiting several poor families, and one mother in particular. She's pregnant with her 8th child, due next month. Her 4 oldest children are in school, 2 are in kindergarten for half days, and she has a baby home all day. One of her boys has been diagnosed with tuberculosis and is going to be hospitalised. I'm trying to help this mother with housework and also to organise her household, but it's quite a challenge. The community centre here has a family planning programme. Now that contraceptive pills are legal and free, most of the mothers are thrilled. Their husbands don't like using condoms, but blame the wife if she gets pregnant. Some even refuse to recognise a child they didn't want. In my opinion, all couples ought to have the chance to plan their families. When we talked about it, you told me that only the rhythm method of birth control is morally acceptable. But if the rhythm method and the birth control pill have the same goal, then isn't it hypocritical of Catholics to say that only one is allowed? How can any woman hope to get her life organised when she is exhausted from being pregnant year after year? It's too easy for priests to preach. For one thing, they're all men, and for another thing, none of them have to cope with their own children. I could go on, but I'll leave it here for now, as I'm sure you're working yourself too hard as always. Thinking of you all, Mary.
On that particular issue, Mary did convince Joseph Wresinski that choices were too limited for women in extreme poverty. However, her passion to support women in deep poverty continued. When the United Nations organised the first ever World Conference on the Status of Women in Mexico City in 1975, both Mary and Wresinski went along with 2 other ATD Fourth World volunteers, Huguette Bosso and Alvin de Vos van Steenwyk. Because ATD had only a few months earlier qualified for consultative status with the UN, this was the first time they could register to attend an international conference. They raised money for the airfare from a women's club in Geneva and avoiding paying for a hotel by convincing a friend of a friend to host them. To prepare, Mary spent months consulting British women living in deep poverty. Among the things they told her,
If you've got nothing, you go without, and you're not even thought of. I had hopes and dreams, but nobody showed any interest. I felt ignored. Some girls were laughed at, and others were pushed into a corner. At that age, you don't know how to get about getting training. And when you've been in kids' homes all your life, nothing's ever been your own. I wanted a home of my own, to belong to somewhere. So to get out of there, I got married at 17. I only knew him 3 weeks. And then with the children, you're shut indoors and you feel cut off, just looking at the wash tub. To get out would cost money, whether it's to go to a pub or an evening class or a club. So all I live for is day to day. My only hope is that my daughters don't have to go through life like I've had to since I've been married. When I heard about women's liberation at first, I thought it was a good idea. But then after hearing 2 or 3 of them talking on the television, I came to the conclusion that there was only a certain class of women speaking out for women as a whole. They are not from all classes, and we all have different needs and different wants. When they say motherhood is menial, I don't agree with what they say on my behalf.
Before Mary and the others travelled to the Mexico City conference, they wrote a study on the unknown woman in extreme poverty. They held a meeting with women in poverty from many countries to create a poster with a poem entitled Ain't I a Woman, and to draft a charter of the Fourth World woman in Spanish, French and English. The charter, published by the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, pointed out that family planning was often beginning to be turned against women in poverty. Among the charter's demands was the right to plan one's family without threats and pressure from social and medical services or from public opinion. Women's decision to limit the number of children they have must be their own choice and not imposed on them because of their poverty and vulnerability. While Wresinski and Alvin DeVos attended the formal meeting of 133 national delegations, Mary and Touquet ran an exhibition stand at the International Women's Year Tribune, a more informal gathering of 6,000 women marked by passionate candour. They met Betty Friedan, author of The Feminine Mystique, and they visited families in an informal settlement in the mountains where 2 former volunteers of ATD were then working. Throughout the conference, the 4 ATD delegates were always up by 6 a.m, updating texts to contribute to the negotiations. To distribute the charter, they would slip into every mailbox of the main hotel rooms. They would talk to every possible journalist, delegate or compatriot, usually until midnight. As Mary put it, in every conversation their concern was that women in poverty be freed from the circle of misery where they are kept in roles of reproducers and feeders of their children, and then judged if they don't conform to what is expected. Huguette focused on cultivating solidarity among women of all backgrounds. She said, "We hoped that women could show a new way forward by making sure that progress for any of us could be progress for all women." Another ATD volunteer at the conference recalled, "We met women representing millions of others who have been oppressed, exploited, humiliated, and silenced throughout history. However, we were soon indignant at the government platitudes and power struggles that stifled efforts to evoke realities of women in deep poverty." As the conference degenerated, our anger drove us to find allies among the conference staff. Every waiter and chambermaid helped us distribute our charter on banquet tables and in bedrooms. One bellboy read our charter and called his friends over saying, "You've got to hear this, it's good." Every woman we spoke with was moved by the question of extreme poverty. To follow up on the conference, Mary wrote hundreds of letters to women they met on every continent. She also shared news from the conference with many British women in poverty. Many of them talked to her about feeling manipulated by doctors into sterilisation.
Some couples in poverty have sterilisation proposed to them when they are very young and do not want to take such an irreversible step. Some doctors, when they have just delivered a baby, then sterilise the mother without her consent. Many poor women and men think that doctors are inclined to decide for them, rather than helping them choose. They resent being pushed into an abortion because of bad housing or low income, or because others think they already have enough children. Coercive sterilisation or abortions are most likely to occur among the poorest families. Women in poverty also noted that even if people are needed to foster and adopt unwanted children, the likes of us don't get a chance to take care of those unwanted children.
The next World Conference on Women took place in Copenhagen in 1980. This time, Mary alone represented ATD Fourth World. In her speech, she convinced the conference to ensure that all development projects take the needs of the poorest women into account. 5 years later, in 1985, Mary represented ATD at the UN Women's Conference in Nairobi. To prepare, Mary interviewed many of the same women in poverty whom she had interviewed in 1975. This time, their teenage daughters joined in the conversation. She was also invited by a British government minister to prepare the Nairobi conference together with members of the government delegation. Mary minced no words in her response.
Having read Her Majesty's government response to the UN questionnaire, The Women's Decade, I would like to express extreme concern that gains made have not benefited all women equally. And that women in the lowest socio-economic groups have benefited least of all. In the attached note, I have drawn out priorities for the coming years concerning education, employment, participation in public life and health. In Nairobi, we will ask delegations how their governments are implementing the resolution put forward by ATD in Copenhagen. Can we count on your support?
The minister was won over and promised to support ATD's contribution in Nairobi. She circulated copies of Mary's 8-page note to all the departments that had contributed to the government report for the UN. The Nairobi conference, attended by 15,000 people, was later referred to as the birth of global feminism. At the conference, Mary organised a workshop to discuss the future for girls of the most impoverished families. 60 women at the workshop of 18 nationalities agreed to stay in touch with ATD Fourth World in the future, forming a loose network of collaboration to defend the future of the poorest girls and women. On Mary's return to London, she was interviewed about the conference. Following the live BBC broadcast, the Vice President of Her Majesty's National Women's Commission told her, "You answered questions brilliantly. Our membership has always been somewhat middle class. We would, however, very much like to represent a broader section of society and thus to extend membership to the women of the Fourth World." Mary agreed, but continued to address her government with vehemence, telling officials,
We are quite concerned about risks of the most disadvantaged women and their families when policies intended for the well-being of all are not carefully monitored. Addressing parental rights and responsibility, as well as free choice in family planning, requires the utmost sensitivity. We must consider the actual experiences of very disadvantaged families through several generations.
Summing up this decade of women's conferences, Mary wrote,
10 years ago, ATD Fourth World brought together women in deep poverty from many countries. The voices in the room were shy and hesitant. Some women wept because they couldn't find words to express themselves. At the same time, it was joyous, simply because we knew that other women at the UN wanted to hear from us. Since then, so many women, men and young people have learnt to speak out and have made a commitment to overcome poverty together. We all set out to look for people who were fearful and unfortunate in order to share with them our hopes and encourage one another to rise up together. The conference in Nairobi was also joyous. Thousands of women looked back at a decade of fighting oppression and building solidarity. As members of ATD, we will continue to look out for people who have been the most beaten down by life, so that together we can progress. Someday, our granddaughters must each have a profession they are proud of, work worth their time, and a role in their communities and nations that enables them and their brothers, husbands and families to contribute to shaping a world of justice and peace. Despite obstacles, we will go onward.